How certain is what we know about nutrition and health in science? It's an interesting question because a lot of people would probably say, oh, we're very certain in what we know is healthy and what is not. But that's sort of changed over time, hasn't it? And it's continuing to change. It's changed in regards to total fat. It's changed in regards to dietary cholesterol. And now it's starting to change for carbohydrates, the amount and the type of carbohydrates, and soy and saturated fats. Now, saturated fats is changing much more slowly, but we have new evidence from a study out of Australia that just gives more support to the fact that saturated fat in and of itself is not harmful and does not need to be avoided for everybody, and that context is very important. So let's unpack this study and then tie it in also to sort of the changing beliefs about soy. I'm Dr. Brett Scher, the medical director at DietDoctor.com, and this first study was published in BMJ Heart and is titled The Association of Carbohydrate and Saturated Fat Intake with Cardiovascular Disease and Mortality in Australian Women. So this was a study that enrolled almost 10,000 women, average age 52, in Australia, and they followed them over 15 years. So it's one of these prospective nutritional epidemiology studies, which is, kind of the lowest quality study because of the food frequency questionnaires and the confounding variables and the healthy user bias and things that we've talked about for quite a while here at Diet Doctor, which really knocks this down in terms of its quality. But here's one of the things that's important. These types of studies, if they show a benefit to a food group that is traditionally thought of to be harmful, that can be helpful because how harmful can it be if a study shows benefit? Even if there's healthy user bias and there's all these other things, but the study shows that it can overcome that. So I know that's a little confusing, but let's talk about this because it really plays into this study. So they followed these women for 15 years. And they looked to see who had heart attacks, who lived, who died, and then correlated it with quintiles of what they ate, either the most carbs versus the lowest carbs, or the most saturated fat versus the lowest saturated fat. And focusing in on the saturated fat, there was no increased risk of heart disease or of dying the more saturated fat the women ate. And in fact, the higher saturated fat eating group was more likely to have a lower risk of hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. Now, that's despite the baseline characteristics of the women eating more saturated fat being less healthy. So here's an important point. I think a big reason why most trials, especially in the United States, or I shouldn't say trials, studies, because these aren't randomized trials, these are studies, why most of the studies in the United States show a worse outcome for people eating more saturated fat is because at baseline, they smoke more, they exercise less, they eat more total calories, they're less interested in their health in general, they have a lower socioeconomic class. All these other factors play into it more than the saturated fat itself. Well, what's interesting in this study, those same characteristics held true. In this study, the women who ate more saturated fat were more likely to smoke, less likely to exercise. They were less educated, they were lower socioeconomic class, they ate more calories in total. Things that are frequently in these types of studies associated with a worse outcome in and of themselves. But despite that, there was no worse outcome for the women who ate the most saturated fat compared to the lowest saturated fat. So that's pretty impressive finding that just gives more evidence that maybe we need to rethink this whole saturated fat thing. It doesn't prove saturated fat is beneficial. It doesn't, prove anything, cause and effect. But it certainly makes you question the danger of saturated fat, especially when it was associated with a decreased risk of hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. And we've been saying this for a long time here at Diet Doctor. It's not the saturated fat, it's the overall dietary composition, right? It's the overall health of the person. If you're eating a hypercaloric diet that's high carb, high fat, and you're gaining weight, it kind of doesn't matter. Everything in that combination is harmful, and saturated fat is part of that. But if you're eating saturated fat containing foods that are natural foods, whole foods, not things, baked and processed, and that's part of a diet that's not excess calories and that's lower in carbohydrates, that is perfectly healthy. And there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that saturated fat by itself is harmful in that type of situation. So maybe that had something to do with these findings. Hard to know because you don't know exactly what the women were eating. Now, the carbohydrate part was also interesting, that the women who ate sort of the middle ground of carbohydrate, what they called quintile 3, which was 41 to 44% energy as carbohydrates, and you compare them to those who ate less than 37%, which was the lowest group, those women had a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, although no difference in mortality, no difference in who lived or died. Now, this is interesting because, again, can you say that therefore eating more carbohydrates is good for your heart? No, you can't, because one, the lowest group was less than 37%, and that's not a true low-carb diet. For really a low-carb diet, you've got to get below 100 grams of carbohydrates, which is usually around 15, maybe 20% of your calories, but not this 37%. That's just a high-carb, sort of high-fat diet combined, which is not what we want to monitor. But the other thing is, all these Bradford Hill criteria, which are basically the criteria to try and say, could an observational study like this have some sort of causality? Well, part of that is a uniform association as things go up. But that was not the case here, because it wasn't the highest group of carbs versus the lowest group of carbs that showed the difference. It was this middle group. Also, these groups are so small, like a difference of 2 or 3% for each group. That's pretty small. So I really question the utility of the data for the carbohydrates. I think that's a lot less helpful. And the saturated fat, again, also has some similar problems, but the reason it's helpful is because it goes against what is promoted in so many other of these weak nutritional epidemiology studies, which makes us say, we really have to think more closely about this. Now, how does this tie into the comment about soy? Well, at the same time that this came out, I saw a post on Twitter linking to the Harvard School of Public Health. And they had a short piece about how soy is basically losing its heart healthy recommendation, or its heart healthy certification, I guess you could say. And that's because, studies have shown it actually doesn't. There is no evidence showing that eating soy reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease. It can reduce your LDL a tiny bit, but that doesn't translate to reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease. But in that same piece, they said, but soy can reduce saturated fat containing foods for protein, so therefore it is beneficial. But again, that's the assumption that saturated fat is harmful in all diets, and that's the tide that's starting to change with some evidence like this. And we have a whole guide on like red meat and a whole part on saturated fat that, again, it's not the saturated fat, it's not the red meat, it's the diet, it's the whole healthy nature of the person. And there's absolutely a role for saturated fat containing foods if they're natural whole foods and part of an overall low carb healthy diet. But some of that's dying hard because Harvard School of Public Health, a lot of the vegan proponents are still going to hit saturated fat as harmful rather than see the bigger picture. And so I thought that was interesting to point out. But the other thing to point out is the way things are changing, right? Soy has been labeled as healthy and heart healthy for a couple decades now, and is losing that label. Now, it doesn't mean it's harmful, right? We have a whole section on a whole post on soy as well. There's some concern about its pro-estrogen or anti-estrogen effects, but there's no convincing human outcome data that it is harmful. Right now, you may choose not to eat it, and that's fine, but it's hard to say the data proves it is harmful. But now we also know the data proves it's not really all that helpful from a cardiovascular standpoint. Again, the context matters. What kind of diet is it a part of? Even vegan diets full of soy can be full of processed, high-carb, basically junk food that can be detrimental to someone's health. So it's about the context of the diet that matters most. But it also shows the changing tide. It used to be all dietary fat was harmful. Now, okay, not all dietary fat is harmful. Nuts and olive oil are healthy fats. Salmon has healthy fats. But this thing about saturated fat is certainly dying slowly, but starting to change for sure. So that's part of what we want to do here at Diet Doctor, is make sure we are staying up to date and being open-minded about the progress of nutritional science and really seeing things from the broader picture rather than good and bad, black and white. Everything has context. And I think that's what these studies really help show, to help us put it in that context so you can decide for you what is a healthy diet. And that's why we focus so much on healthy weight loss, improving metabolic health, improving your lean mass, maintaining your resting metabolic rate, finding a diet you enjoy and can sustain long term. These are all components of a healthy lifestyle, not just good and bad, foods, but the overall context. So anyway, if you thought this was helpful, give us a thumbs up and click the subscribe button so you'll get all our updates here on Diet Doctor News on YouTube. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day.